Thank you very much, Sean Carroll, for saying yes to this. Like I wrote in my email, I've been following your work for many, many years, and I uh, I don't know if you remember, but actually the first time we had a talk, it was during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. It was like in January 2021, or something like this.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember we had a great dialogue, and you sent me a lovely email afterwards, and I and for this project, and back then we were dealing with very different and struggling with very different things, than
Yeah.
we're doing now, and as Ukrainians, and now like for this project, I hope to like through these conversations to give my fellow citizens, Ukrainians, the chance to like think about something else, to think about other things,
Sure.
and yeah, and like take their mind at least for a while, away from that like route. And I already had the chance to talk to the other Sean Carroll, which for this project,
Oh,
which is
good.
yeah,
Good.
yeah, which is very good. And I felt like
Let's do Sean. Yeah.
yeah, I felt like if I didn't talk to both of you for this project, it wouldn't feel complete, to me. So yeah.
Oh, okay. So the balance of the Sean Carroll universe. Yeah.
Yeah, so uh, well, I'd like to ask you first, to start off, like I imagine for people who do what you do, it all begins at a very young age, right? So, and
Oh, yeah.
could you please uh, like take us back maybe to your childhood, when you're uh, like first getting interested in this kind of stuff, and maybe was there maybe a particular moment, that's stuck with you, maybe
Oh,
some, yeah.
it's very clear. And we're recording, right? So you're good. Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I grew up in an industrial part of the United States in a place called Toledo, Ohio. And there was not a lot of nature around. But there were some woods and there were some parks to go to and things like that. And when I went out into those more wild areas and found myself, flipping over logs and things and finding salamanders or frogs by the side of a pond or maybe a snake going through leaves, it was thrilling. I just love finding these small creatures, out in the woods, and I'd bring them into my house, into my bedroom, and put them in glass aquaria and take care of them. That meant feeding them, what they needed and observing them. And I think that's that, and probably through television, is how I fell in love with the animal kingdom. And I dreamed of going to the places that I would see on television. And at this time, those were television films were in black and white, so you didn't see the color of these places. But I fell in love with the animal kingdom as a child. I loved looking at animals close up. I loved the patterns on their bodies. I had snakes that had stripes and spots and things like that. And I think that just I was fascinated by these creatures, and that was the seed, long before I could think of anything sophisticated. That was just the attraction that pulled me into biology.
Yeah, and I've always been asking myself this kinds of big questions. So I'd like to dive right in, and
Sure.
and the you talk a lot about, for example, in your book, A Series of Fortunate Events, right? This theme of chance is like, at the very heart of this book, and you you talk a lot about Jacques Monod, and and like this great biologist, who had a great influence on you. And for me personally, it's like this very idea that there's like ultimately nothing in charge, and that everything like is governed by chaos and randomness. It's just, you know uh, it's it it's such a difficult idea now to try and accept, or like to try and wrap your head around, because as human beings, we have this like natural tendency, I guess, to look for reasons for why things happen, or we like depend on, or we try to find some contingency, right? We think that
Yes.
we think that something like must come from something else, or something like depends on something else, and like it just goes totally against that, like human intuition that we have. And I'm curious, like, have you been able to, like, personally on a personal Sean Carroll level, to come to grips with this view of life, as someone, who spends so much time thinking about it, and have you been able to do it, or?
I, I think so. I think so. And I think the journey of that was I first read Jacques Monod's book called Chance and Necessity in college. Okay, so um, I was just a biology student, and I didn't know where this idea sort of came from. Right, you're just at that end of the learning, you're just sort of drinking everything that's offered to you. Um, but I think over the decades of studying the evolutionary process and also just living life, um, I think I've come to appreciate it in my bones, right? I've really internalized it as a part of a worldview. And what I tried to do in the book was make this more tangible for readers and for anyone. And so I picked a few collisions, a few accidents to focus on. So can I talk about that just a little bit? Because I think, when you just sit back and you talk about chance and all that, I think you need some concrete examples to really think about that, how the world or our species or things would be different if things had just happened in a little bit different way. Everyone has largely heard of the asteroid that hit the Earth 66 million years ago. I mean, there's a great backstory there, which is the scientists that discovered that and put forward that idea around 1980. They were greeted with tremendous amount of skepticism. So, something that we now accept as having happened, it was hard for scientists to accept that the world had changed so dramatically, so instantaneously with an asteroid impact. But then when over 40 years or so of studying this impact and understanding that, first of all, those impacts are very rare. Impacts of that size are very rare. It may be the largest impact on the moon or the Earth in the last 500 million years. So it's a 6-mile wide rock that hit the Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula, the current Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and triggered a worldwide environmental shock that caused the collapse of the biosphere. So you realize it's rare, and then as scientists have studied this, you understand, well, first of all, that asteroid could have easily missed the Earth, or it could have landed somewhere else. It's going 50,000 miles an hour. The Earth is turning at 1,000 miles an hour. It turns out where it hit matters. Geologists think that the nature of the rock that it hit, that liberated a lot of carbonates and sulfates into the atmosphere, that contributed to the extinction event. So had it hit somewhere else, we might not have had a mass extinction. Well, why does that matter? Well, it's very clear, even clearer now than it was 40 years ago, that without that mass extinction that really ended the age of reptiles, dominated by large reptiles on land, large reptiles in the seas, mammals would have probably remained a pretty obscure group. Mammals existed. They existed for easily 100 million years before the asteroid, but they were generally small, sort of, filling little gaps and spaces. But after the asteroid, when all the large dinosaurs are gone from the sea, from the land, mammals take off. And within 1 million years, they become larger than they've ever been in their 100 million year history. So that to me is a very clear signature that this event, this rock hitting the Earth, sort of changed the trajectory of life on Earth and took out the large reptiles and opened the space for mammals. Well, if that hasn't happened, well, all the branches of mammals that we all know, including our own, would not nearly be as abundant and diverse as we find today. So I think it's easy to say, without that asteroid, you and I don't have this conversation, right? Without that asteroid, lots of things don't exist. So, and since we can find evidence for that impact, that the fallout from that impact all over the globe, and I've been fortunate to go to some places and put my finger right on that boundary in Europe and in North America. It's a spine-tingling experience. When you walk past, when you see an open rock face anywhere in the world, and you see sort of the layers like in a layer cake, and we probably don't give it any thought, but there are some of those layers mark dramatic changes in the story of life on Earth, and to put your finger on a centimeter wide boundary and realize that life before that boundary is totally different from life after that boundary or after the impact. So the accidental nature of that collision, there's all sorts of asteroids in the solar system. Most of them don't hit the Earth or hit the moon. This one hit. It happened to hit in a place that mattered when it easily could have hit somewhere else, or of course missed. And you realize that the fate of life was changed by this, pretty random collision. We can move on to a second story because it's important to the human story, but another collision I talk about in the book has to do with collisions of the continents, and people are fairly familiar with the idea of continental drift and that things have moved around on the surface of the Earth. Well, one of the more recent events is the Indian subcontinent, which 65 million years ago or so was down by Madagascar, has moved north relatively quickly and slammed into the Asian continent. And that collision is what built the Himalaya, the huge mountain, the largest mountain ranges, on Earth. Well, it turns out that has huge climate changing implications. And it's the building of that mountain range started pulling more and more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, cooling down the Earth, cooling the poles, ice building at the poles, and eventually flips us into an ice age. You'd say, okay, so what? This is, why are you filling my head with all this stuff? Well, ice ages are really weird and rare. We're in the first ice age in 300 million years. And while that ice age for where I grew up had the history of that is ice sheets advancing and retreating in cycles over 10, 20,000 years. In Africa, it's wet and dry cycles. And why does that matter? Well, these flips in climate are pretty tricky. They've been really hard on, for example, a lot of groups of mammals. You see a lot of extinctions during the ice ages. But one group has done pretty well. And during the period of the ice ages, the sort of first phase of the ice age, their brains tripled in volume. And that's us. That's our ancestors. So we appear to be a primate, an ape, that through tool making and expansions in brain size and all that comes with that, communications, more sophisticated behavior, our ability to shape our own habitat has made us resilient to the climate flipping through the ice ages. So this collision of the Indian subcontinent, which was set in place by the breakup of continents a long time ago, over 100 million years ago, that collision set things in motion, which had a lot to do with the evolution of our species. So I think those just two collisions they're recent. Their causal connection to the way the world is today are really now ever more richly understood. And when I think about that, I think, wow, we are here by accident. Everything's here by accident. And I know that's unnerving. I think there's maybe two polar reactions to that. One is unnerving because we'd like to think there are more benevolent, intentional forces at work, on our planet. But I'm going to offer another one. I think it's awe-inspiring in two ways. I think we then get this perspective of we are just passengers on this planet sailing through the cosmos. These events that have happened, that have shaped life on Earth, were set in motion a long time ago. The evolution of the solar system, the evolution of our continents, and we're just passengers, we're just riding on this constantly changing planet, and we figured this out. The two stories I've told you, Jacques Monod didn't know. Couldn't have told you that 50 years ago. The asteroid impact was unknown. The impact of the Indian subcontinent, the building of Himalayas was unknown. So I think the spectacular contribution of science is to sort of continually shape our understanding of ourselves, in our lives, and in the planet, in a historical context. And so I hope people can find some awe in that, and and look up. I mean, it's hard to see this boundary. I mean, we can look at a rock face, if you see a rock cut anywhere where you can, and sort of appreciate the history that's recorded there. But look up at the moon at night and look at the craters and realize all those were made by impacts. I mean, the moon is, because it has no atmosphere and it has no growth on it, you can see all the craters, right? And you realize the moon's been bombarded. Well, the Earth has been bombarded. A lot of those craters are all covered up because of, we got a lot of water on the planet. We, of course, have a lot of vegetation. Can't see the craters too easily. But you appreciate that a lot's happened. There's a great crater in the state of Arizona. So if anyone has the fortune to come to the U.S. and if you visit the Grand Canyon, which is the most spectacular site in North America, maybe one of the most spectacular sites on Earth, just a bit east of the Grand Canyon, there's a great meteor crater, beautiful meteor crater from a meteor that hit, I think, about 50,000 years ago. And you can go up to the edge and just look at this and just appreciate that it's one of the best exposed meteor craters on the face of the planet. It's in the state of Arizona. I think all this just gives you perspective of, we're passengers on this pretty spectacular home.
Yeah, and on that note, it relates to another question I want to ask you. That we sometimes have this misconception in society that science is only useful if we can put it to, if we can make a better toaster out of it, or a better car, some better technology. But for me, it's exactly like what you were saying about perspective and making us reassess our view of ourselves. And I know that Jacques Monod himself, he wrote about this very idea that the purpose of science is to change our view of ourselves and our relationship with nature. And so it's just, yes, strikes me that well, obviously I love using this technology, and I benefit from it tremendously. The fact that we're able to talk we're even over thousands of miles away, but it's incredible. But yeah, for me, it's about giving that perspective when I look at some of the Hubble space telescope images, or when you're able to, for example, look down at a single cell, right, through a microscope, and you realize that there's trillions of those cells inside your body, and all working together to produce a conscious being. It's just it's incredible. So yeah,
it's amazing. Yeah, fortunately, science contributes to both, but I don't think we want to overlook, again, the perspective that we get from thinking about our place, our relationships to things. I think it's life enriching, right? I think the great thing about science is a cumulative body of knowledge. You can think about other things in human affairs where sort of, things flip in different directions and sometimes, progress is ephemeral, right? Things things are made and things are unmade, right? But in science, that's a cumulative body of knowledge. And, just to understand that dinosaurs did what once, from the planet. I'm really glad we know that. I'm really glad we can interpret those bones. But think of how young this understanding is. Think of how young science is relative to, for example, just human society and human culture. That, really thinking started to change dramatically. Yes, it started to change with the astronomers for sure. But, we're living beings. And I think our thoughts about ourselves started to change really with Darwin, right? He just goes on a journey around the world for 5 years and comes back and thinks, things are different than I was essentially raised to think them to be, and gave us an entire new framework for thinking about ourselves and our relationships to things, and obviously a powerful framework then for really understanding life. And that understanding has contributed to a lot of technology, but just the bigger perspective is life enriching. I think, science, like music, like art, like literature, it can enrich our lives with that. I mean, it's the same thing. If you said, well, what good is a novel, right? It's just a made up story. How is that? How is that? How is that? Well, it enriches us. It gives us insight into the human condition, things like this, right? So I think I think people often think of science as, its utility for technology, but I think that I think we'd also should include science when we think about other great human endeavors like art and music and literature. It's one of our creations. We're a creative species. It's one of our creations, and it's changed our view of ourselves profoundly, especially in the last 200 years.
Yeah, and actually, I can't help but ask you just a fun question about Darwin. You mentioned, Charles Darwin, like the father of evolution, and he's like someone to people like you, biologists, as like perhaps Einstein is to physicists, or something like this. So like obviously, very important to the field. And what do you think? If you had a chance to talk to him today, if like somehow, if we do a time travel, and like you also said about science as being like this cumulative body of knowledge, right? That we accumulate so much knowledge. And when you think about all the knowledge that we have accumulated and gained since his death, right? And what aspect of biology do you think would have surprised him the most? Would it be like the role of chance, maybe, that you explore? Or?
I think he knew two things were really important, but couldn't say much. Heredity had to be important, right? How traits were inherited, and so what we now would talk about in terms of genes and DNA. So of course, didn't know about genes and DNA. And he knew that embryology was really important. He knew that process of the making of creatures was really important because it must be changes in that process that give you different kinds of creatures. So today I could sit down with Charles, and it would take a while to talk about all that we've learned about DNA and genes and traits, but I feel really comfortable saying it would blow his mind, probably more than once. And then show him those embryos. You mentioned just a couple minutes ago about looking at cells and appreciating trillions of cells in the body. But one of the most spectacular processes we can see in nature is the making of a creature. And to watch an embryo form, watch a single cell become many, and then organs and tissues to form, it's endlessly amazing to look at. And this is a fortunate part of my background, is that I got to study animal development for an extended period of my career. And I can tell you, gazing through a microscope, looking at embryos developing, I was never bored, for 1 second in my life, because it's just so gripping. and to see something, take shape before your eyes, right? Something that's sort of uniform, then start to take shape before your eyes. It's really something. And I think we can all appreciate that, right? I mean, I've had, I didn't bear children. I'm the father of children. But when you just think about the process of making a new being, um, doesn't matter how much science I tell you about it, it's an awesome process. It's just awesome when you imagine a single egg, a single fertilized egg becoming a complex individual, whether that's a human or a butterfly or a giraffe. Um, it's pretty amazing. And I think these things, there are some phenomena, many phenomena in nature and that our lives are close to, that we maybe just don't stop and give it enough thought. If you see a plant sprouting and it's going to give rise to, then flowers are going to come out and things like that. Just to appreciate, what does that represent? What's going on there? And you could see it in your window box, right? You can observe these phenomena all over the place. And we can think, of course, about the making of humans as well. And I just think that if we go there, can spend a little time there, that I think we it's life enriching. And I think the big awe feelings that we get of, especially, looking up at space, or, considering the vastness of time, or objects of wonder, a beautiful flower, an insect, a bird in flight. These are things that this gallery is open all the time, right? It's available to us all the time, if we can just take a few minutes to enjoy it.
And Darwin himself had like 10 children, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Yeah, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he was not a very productive, only not just a very productive scientist, but in that regard, as a father also. But
Darwin, and there's always the risk that these figures become, I don't know, almost sort of like two-dimensional icons. But I think what's great and really rewarding about the Darwin story, for those who want to dig into it, and I think that story is accessible to anyone. The Darwin story is something I think that, kids should be reading in school, not for scientific detail, but just to appreciate the process. Here's a 22-year-old young man just graduating college. His intention is to go on and join the clergy, very respectable profession at the time, and very linked to the higher education in Britain. All the faculty are ordained members of the clergy. That was going to be his plan. But he had this interest in nature, and he had some experience in some field geology, and got this invitation. He was not the first choice. He was the third choice, I think. He got this invitation to serve as sort of a gentleman naturalist on this voyage of the Beagle, a voyage that was only supposed to go 2 years. And it winds up going 5 years. And he goes around the world. And any Hollywood scriptwriter would realize that that's an epic journey, right? That is the hero's journey, in obvious form. But his diary, what he experienced, what he sees, the diary he makes, the book he eventually writes that we know, Voyage of the Beagle, which is just fun. It's just fun to go discover the world, through Darwin's eyes. But by the time he arrives home, there's the germs of two big ideas, that are going to change the world. And he's 27 years old at the time. And I just think, as people, and if you start to study his life and you realize, he was a nice person. He was a good human being. He was kindly. He was considerate of other people's feelings. He understood that some of the ideas he was hatching would rock people's foundations. but he was very trusted. He was the magistrate. He ended up being the magistrate in his town. He handled little squabbles in his hometown. He was, that's how trusted he was. And so I think that there's a risk that people only see him in a portrait of a long gray beard, almost inaccessible on the mountaintop. But this father of 10 children, and I just think a very likable and admirable human being, with great adventures, and who wrote them up so that we can still enjoy them, 180 years later. So that's just encouragement, that I think that some of these great adventures in science that are so well chronicled, either by the adventurers themselves or subsequent historians, these are treasure troves of human drama and creativity and achievement, struggle and achievement, and I think they're very inspiring stories to dig into. And I don't think you have to, and you don't have to be a scientist to enjoy them at all.
And you talk a lot about Jacques Monod, who we've already mentioned, right? And you have, I would say, a certain fascination with him, right? That he's had I guess, a huge impact on you, and his book Chance and Necessity that you mentioned, right? That he came up with in 1970, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
And more than 50 years ago now, and also you talk a lot about in your joint biography of Monod and Camus, right? You talk a lot about the relationship. Albert Camus, obviously very famous French philosopher and writer, and it's, for me, it's such a fascinating history. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what their interactions were like, and the kinds of how they influenced each other's work, because
Yeah.
I think
Well,
it's fascinating because it gets at the very core, I guess, of in many ways of what it means to be human, of this kinds of questions. So yeah, maybe if you could tell us a bit more about.
Monod and Camus. Well, you're asking a question that I asked myself at some point. I knew about Jacques Monod first because of the beautiful biology that he had accomplished, particularly with his collaborator, Francois Jacob. And you learn that as a biology student, the fundamentals of gene regulation, how genes are turned on and off. They did the pioneering work in bacteria in a series of studies over the 1950s and very early 1960s that really became a foundation in molecular biology. But I read somewhere that Jacques Monod was in the French Resistance during World War II, and that at some point in his life he was friends with Albert Camus, and I wanted to know more, but I really only could get sentence-long descriptions of this. And I kind of held that thought for 30 years. I happened to have an exposure to French literature in college, a deep exposure to French literature in college, while also studying biology. So I had just some interest in these figures. And I thought, okay, if I'm ever going to get the chance, can I find a way to figure out, well, exactly what was this relationship between Monod and Camus? So I'm telling you how I got into it for a second, just to say that's exactly the question. What you just asked me was a question I had around 2010. Maybe I had a question I probably had for decades before that, but right around 2010, I thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can get anywhere on this story. If I can find some original material, maybe I can dig into it and illuminate something about their friendship. And then again, through all sorts of chance encounters and lucky moments and things like that, all sorts of materials came to me from people who knew Jacques Monod in particular personally, or who were close to him, including family members. But that also turned up a bunch of materials on Camus, in fact, materials that were in Monod's possession. And so important to know that, so both men were in the French resistance. They were in different resistance groups during World War II. And I have no evidence they could have encountered each other, but they would have been using aliases. So I don't have any evidence that they met during World War II. But upon the liberation of France, this was this huge relief and joy of after 4 years of German occupation. There was a lot of getting together of members of the resistance and of thinking about the future of France. And Monod was dealing with some issues. His only really public pronouncements, or he wrote something for a French newspaper about what was a beginning controversy at the time, which was coming out of the Soviet Union. And that had to do with biology and someone that Stalin had essentially put in charge of biology, as a character named Lysenko. And Monod wrote a really detailed, damning critique of Lysenko, who did really essentially take down Soviet biology, sort of built it all on mythology and false information. And Camus was having the same concerns about the communist movement out of the Soviet Union, which had a lot of influence in France, particularly on the political left. So while Camus was working on a book that was going to be sort of an expose of the failures of Soviet-style communism, he hears about and then meets this scientist who has his own critiques of what Soviet Union was doing to science. And they hit it off because they had just experienced the crushing rule of Nazi Germany, built on mythology and on this supposedly infallible leader. And they saw the Soviet Union as having really the same makeup, that it was just a replay of what they'd experienced during World War II. So they really joined forces to speak out against Soviet-style communism in France. And that mattered a lot because the Communist Party was very popular in France at the end of World War II. The communists had led really the resistance movement, particularly the armed resistance movement in France. And there was a lot of, and Soviet Union and what came out of Moscow had a lot of influence in France. But now voices like Camus and Monod were speaking up and saying, wait, this is nonsense. What's being said about history or what's being said about science, this is nonsense. It's this authoritarian, totalitarian type state, and they needed to send that alarm through society. Camus had a tremendous platform. He was anonymously widely read during the resistance, and then when it became clear who he was, once France was liberated, he was a national hero. And Monod was a friend, and they met, and I have lots of evidence of their meetings and correspondence and things like this. But it's quite clear that in their writing, Monod gave Camus some valuable information in a book he wrote called L'Homme Révolté, or The Rebel, which was his expose of the Soviet Union. There's a section in there on science, which I know from, in fact, unpublished stuff from Monod Camus was the beneficiary of Monod's insights. But I can see Camusian thought all through Monod's writing. And in fact, Monod's book, Chance and Necessity, opens with a segment. The epigraph is a segment from Camus' book, The Myth of Sisyphus. So these two men had a very warm, very mutually, they were certainly mutual admirers. In fact, I got a quote from someone that Camus once said that he's only met one true genius, and that was Jacques Monod. So, it was a really, for each of them, I think, a very important friendship because Camus was losing his friends on the political left, most famously Jean-Paul Sartre, but he was gaining new friends like Monod, who were more, you know, who were rock solid, sort of empirically, right? They were not just armchair philosophers. They were, you know, Monod had a great scientific foundation, and then Monod, who was really interested in sort of the philosophical dimensions of science, has has Camus a conversation partner in the cafes of Paris. So I think this was just a kind of a beautiful friendship that served them from post-war period to 1960 when Camus died tragically in a car accident. Even then, Camus' influence was clearly beyond that time. In fact, you could argue for a little while that maybe Monod almost took Camus' place a little bit as a public person in France. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1965, the newspaper, it is the first time France had swept the Nobels, I think, in decades. And Monod was really well prepared to become a public figure. He was incredibly articulate. He was bilingual. His mother was American, so he knew English very well. So he did very well with the British press, the American press. He was a very charismatic person, very thoughtful person. And so he, for example, when Martin Luther King came to Paris in 1966, it was Monod who introduced King to Paris. Big event, that sort of thing. So Monod was very concerned with civil rights. He was very concerned with women's reproductive rights. He was very concerned with student rights. He was deeply involved in the riots of 1968 when there were huge riots and rebellion in the French universities, and Monod was sort of a go-between between the students and the government, so much so that people encouraged him to run for president of France. So that's a little bit on Monod, but to study those characters and to see how Camus, who was he was a novelist and a newspaper man, but it was the circumstances of World War II that by accident, and he easily could have been caught and deported. He had some close calls. He winds up being almost the conscience of France. And his editorials are so inspiring and so exhilarating still to read, 80 years later. So he just found himself going from, an obscure, philosopher writer to an international figure in a short period of time. And Monod, who was studying phenomena in bacteria that probably only 20 people in the world had ever heard of, winds up discovering fundamental secrets of life that, for example, it certainly gave birth to the capability to do genetic engineering and things like this. But he was interested in bigger issues, philosophical issues, and that's what's evidenced by his writings like Chance and Necessity. So, again, much like Darwin and Wallace and all sorts of people, it's just really enriching to delve into these lives. And I didn't, for example, nothing. It was you wouldn't talk about what you did in the French Resistance. It would post-war. It would seem, I don't know, boastful or something like that. I think when resistance got together, they could share stories because they had been through it. But Monod didn't really talk about what he did in the French Resistance. I had to reconstruct that from, in fact, people who worked with him in the French Resistance, and from all sorts of documents and letters he wrote. So part of my admiration for Monod is that when his country, when its existence was threatened, he put his life on the line. He went underground and he worked for the resistance and he wore a disguise and wound up being one of the major officers in Paris at the time of the liberation of the city. And those experiences certainly shaped his or reinforced the principles that he held. And so anytime he saw, he was reacting to the situation in the Soviet Union, but I think anytime he saw power overwhelming individuals' rights and individual freedom, and or power overwhelming scientific truth, he spoke up. So I think it's a very relevant set of values around the globe today.
But okay, let's get into this.
That's a long answer, right? But
No,
I'm
no,
giving
no,
you, I'm giving you these soliloquies, and you can just
yeah, yeah.
pick at it whatever you want. Yeah.
No, that's perfect actually, because yeah, I want to to dive really deep into this. So yeah, long answers are always encouraged, and I want to ask with like with this series of this chain of events that have led to us being here, and to be talking to each other, like it just seems to me like such an incredible for a set of accidents that that like everything has had to turn out just right, for us to be here. And don't you ever have the sense like could it really uh, be all just by accident, or maybe there's like like some design behind it? Or I guess you don't buy that, but it's
No,
just
I just
yeah,
think it's unlikely.
yeah.
If you visited Earth 20,000 years ago, you wouldn't see any civilization, and probably the hominids wouldn't be that. I mean, the Homo sapiens wouldn't be that impressive relative to everything else that you'd see on the planet. So, humans, we've we've had a good run for 10,000 years, and things would probably been interesting, beginning maybe 5,000 years ago or so. But um, right, we somehow think that it's all about us. But I think you look at Earth's story and you're like, no, 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 no. This has been going on for 4.5 billion years, and animal evolution's been going on for over 500 million years, and here we are. And I think there's two sides. First of all, I don't see all things leading to humans. And second of all, I don't see things guaranteeing our persistence either, right? We live on a very dynamic planet. We are, and I'm not going to lecture on this, but I mean, we are reshaping the planet, both in terms of the abundance of all other species, but its climate and atmosphere and oceans. And if you go back to previous periods of change in the Earth, all of those mass extinctions are triggered by global climatic change, whether it's driven by an asteroid impact or driven by, for example, volcanism. That's what triggers wholesale changes in life on Earth. So, the past is really informative to the present, and now we are the asteroid, right? We are the species influencing life on the planet and each other, right? So yeah, I don't see any intention, any purpose. I don't see anything coming to save us. It's up to us.
And it's actually what reminds me of what Carl Sagan, when they took that famous pale blood image, you remember, yeah? And
Yes.
and there was like this his beautiful description of it, and he was saying that like there's no hint that help
Yeah.
could come from elsewhere. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's up to us.
Sagan.
Yeah,
Yeah. Again, there's somebody for people to I think Carl died in 1996, maybe something like that. And while, I'm glad his name still resonates through time. He was an extraordinary communicator. He had this blend of scientist and poet, and a great writer. And on the spur of the moment could really evoke awe and emotion. And so Sagan, I think especially his book, Science, A Candle in the Darkness. I forgot the title right. The Demon Haunted World. Science as a Candle in the Darkness. Had a lot to say, and some of it is scarily prescient of our current times. He saw the threat of misinformation and of, politically driven misinformation in sort of misleading large populations of people and to do things that were self-destructive. So so Sagan, I think, had his head in the stars a lot of the time, but he had his heart very much on Earth, and a very interesting character of a mixture. I think in the type of people we're talking about here, Darwin, Monod, etc. They were incredible scientists, but they were incredible human beings.
And actually, I love bringing up this image. It's the
Yeah,
it's part of that. Yeah, and
Blue Dot.
yeah, I hold it very dear to my heart because like, and
That's beautiful. That's
yeah,
beautiful. And can I tell you a little story
yeah,
about,
sure.
You may know that the image was sort of updated on the anniversary. Have you seen the image from Cassini, right? That yeah. I was there when that image, the updated image was revealed. Carl Sagan's papers were being donated to the Library of Congress, a very magnificent building here in Washington, D.C. And I don't know if you know the American entertainer Seth MacFarlane. So Seth is the creator of lots of various cartoon,
Family
like
Guy, yeah.
Family Guy and things like this, but also the movies Ted and things like that. Huge Carl Sagan fan. So it was through Seth that the papers were being donated. And on that occasion, Carolyn Porco, who was in charge of the Cassini mission and who was on the imaging team of Voyager, who took the original blue dot photograph, they updated it from Cassini, and it's a spectacular photo. And the one great thing about NASA, you were holding up the image, but for all your listeners to know, is that you can just go online and all the NASA images are free to the public. And you can look at these beautiful images taken by Voyager on its tour, including the blue dot, and then Cassini's view of the Earth looking back, taken around, I think, 2012, 2013. And this is that feeling of awe, that Sagan captured it. There we are, a blue dot, and I think that there's, I think, a fair, and this is a little special area of interest to me, is sort of the psychological research around the areas of awe and wonder and what those experiences of awe do for us, individually and collectively. It's not just a nice feeling. It's a feeling that opens up our curiosity. It's also a feeling that connects us to others. Great psychological research on awe and wonder, and Sagan was a great communicator of awe and wonder.
And that's to me like the real and the greatest gift of science, is that like images like this, they
Yeah. I mean, going back to what we said, many minutes ago about science as being a source of technology. Okay, fine. But science is a source of awe and wonder. Oh my goodness. This is what we look for out of other human endeavors, art, music, etc. Right? We look for that feeling, right? And it's there from science if communicated well and if people are receptive to it. And I think more and more this is really important for science to be in people's hearts, not just their heads.
Okay, I'd like to ask you also about here in Ukraine we've been like dealing with lots of things as you well know, and it's this whole project of mine. It's it's available for everyone. Everyone who understands English, would be able to get like all the ideas. But in particular, this is aimed at a Ukrainian audience. And we live in this world in which like English is so widely spoken, and lots of people speak and understand it well. And I'm sure you notice this also. When you travel around the world, right? It's incredible because yeah, English is such a like widespread language now, and but even for those who like have some trouble with English, I hope to be able to translate this into Ukrainian so that they also can understand all the like ideas being discussed. But the question I'd like to ask you, like regarding Ukraine, is is there like some message that you would like to share with us, Ukrainians, on maybe how to remain hopeful, have to just it's at times like this it can be it's kind of natural to feel depressed, and to
Yeah.
and to even like give up any kind of hope, and and like but it's fascinating for me because like people like who um, who know so much about life, how it works at a deep level, and who have acquired so much knowledge throughout their lives. I think there is like a certain perspective that comes with it, and maybe if you can uh, like maybe offer some words of wisdom, or give us a little bit of perspective, or or maybe provide a sense of
Well,
solace. Yeah, I know it's
I
very
think
difficult
I think
because yeah.
I think to be honest, it's the other way around. I think Ukrainians have something to teach the rest of the world. So I think I think the vast feeling of Americans is admiration for courage, persistence in the face of great danger and a larger power. So, it's forget American politics, which gets you these changing messages. I think at a very human level, what Americans recognize, and I think the overwhelming message is this is a country that cherishes freedom. This is a country and that freedom means all sorts of things. Freedom for people to just live their lives, freedom of thought, um, freedom to elect your own leaders, things like this. So if America means anything, Ukraine is an incredible testament to those values. So that's why America should be supporting Ukraine, both materially and emotionally and politically in every way possible. We're in our own tough times where we have these inconsistencies. So, but I think Ukraine, again, I go back. To me, it seems silly sitting here in the security of my office in Maryland to say I have anything to offer to quote, sort of tell Ukraine other than to encourage that courage and resilience. And the only things I know about are history. I've never lived through anything, just nothing comparable. I've only experienced it through history. And the period I may know best is, for example, the period of resistance in World War II. And what did people have there? They had solidarity. They had courage. They had their principles of what they were standing up for, and they had allies in the world. They had other people in the world who gave material support and military support, as the case may be. So we can look to history and say that, resistance to oppression is a big story throughout all of history, and it's a horrific experience. But Ukraine has shown, tremendous courage, tremendous persistence. There's tremendous leadership in the country. So yeah, the only thing I would say is look a little bit to history, which you probably all do, of holding out against oppression and danger, and hope that the rest of the world helps enough to turn the tide and get this, get peace and independence back.
Yeah, but I was thinking like, um, with this perspective that science gives us, do you think that, like, in what ways, this could be useful for us Ukrainians, like, uh, like, do you think that learning more about, how life works, or like how we're all connected, maybe some of these messages could provide some
Well,
solace?
I think being all connected, that is a really important perspective of how connected we are, because our political divisions are not biological divisions, right? Right. We are one species with a very, very young history. Um, and I think there's been a lot of hope over time that war would become less and less frequent, and seem to be almost obsolete, right? I mean, you think of the history of Europe and all the wars among countries of Europe, and now they've formed a union, and this is a remarkable thing for history, right? Is that centuries and centuries and centuries of conflict, and it's resolved. And even if you look at World War II, the United States did something extraordinary in its relationships with Germany and Japan, and it actually helped rebuild those countries as opposed to just subjugate them, right? So there are times when humanity takes a step forward, and then of course there's times when it takes a step backwards. But I think, hope is a very complex emotion. It says that we're not sure how things are going to turn out, but maybe if we try, it will turn out for the better. So I hope that what the messages that come from the rest of the world are hopeful, are encouraging. Um, I wish they weren't so inconsistent from this country, but we're in our own political conflict that is unsettled, very unsettled. And there's changes happening here, hopefully short term, but there are changes happening here which I never thought would go on here. So that's unfortunate, because I think it's taken we're not living up to our best principles in the United States. So we'll just look to Ukraine for inspiration there. Yeah, I think that's important to know, that I think Ukraine is an inspiration to the rest of the world, and what the rest of the world can do is just support that.
No, thank you. That's actually a very beautiful message to share. And I think the kind of takeaway message from your book series of fortunate events, and it's one that's actually quite relevant to us Ukrainians, is that it's it's worth celebrating the very fact that we exist at all, right? That we should be lucky that we're here at all. But this amazing accident and that well, uh, life is very difficult, and like I I I wouldn't pretend that it's all about like just love, or or like just wonderful moments. That it's got its
Yeah.
own tragedies and so on. But I think like for me, it's regardless of like all this like crazy stuff that's happening in the surrounding environment, it's always good to try and to remember like this like incredible unlikeliness of as we were saying, of us being here, and that how precious life is. And for me it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's something that we should always be reminded of. And it for me personally it does help. I don't know like if you can say
And,
anything.
and when that day comes, when the threat, we hope, is over, all these feelings about what's precious about life and what connects us, et cetera, this will surge up and shape the future of Ukraine and its relationships with other countries. That's, I think, what we've seen in history, is that, yeah, under that dark oppression, there's the immediate challenge of survival and of keeping functioning. But when that is relieved, there's all sorts of fresh perspective on living. And so I think you don't dare think about that yet, because you don't know how much longer you have to put up with this. But it is perhaps something that might helps people keep going, is to know that there will be a new world, a new opportunity when this threat is taken away. So we just
But
sooner rather than later.
yeah, but it's kind of all that we have, to me, this perspective, in a world where like there's so little that's under our control, like, we didn't choose to be in this war, obviously, and it's kind of
Yeah.
all that we have is how we choose to look at it, for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of perspective.
Yeah. But in that perspective, yeah, the perspective that's forming, I think, is sort of under this threat. This experience obviously will shape all Ukrainians for the rest of their lives, and shape Ukrainian culture, in terms of the stories that are told to the next generations of Ukrainians. This experience will shape to a great deal. And I think I try to say that as a sense of hope, is that yes, the threat has to be taken away, but after that threat will hopefully be some flourishing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, let's all hope so. That's like the best we can do now. And well, I don't want to take too much of your time because you said in your email that you're quite limited in this regard. So I just would like to say that it's been a huge pleasure, for me uh, to talk to you. It's like something that I look forward to for quite some time. But I'm very happy that it's finally worked out, and it's and
My honor.
I'm also very glad that like you wrote me in your email that uh, one of your books, Endless Forms, Most Beautiful, it will be available in Ukrainian soon. Yeah, so because
Yeah.
one of Ukrainian publishers has
Yeah.
has acquired the translation rights to that work, so it's also wonderful. And yeah, let's look
Yeah.
forward to that. Once that becomes once that comes out. So
That's
thank you.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah. Oh.
I was just say, please stay in touch. Happy to talk again. I thought, is there anything you would like to have gone into that we didn't today, or
No, it's I'm very glad because it went in a somewhat different direction. So that's always very
okay.
nice. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Well,
always yeah,
you threw me
yeah,
questions very close to my heart, and
yeah.
I'm ready
Uh,
to
it's
dive into those. Yeah.
well, and I've never been to the US, so I hope that at some point I could visit your country and maybe we could go for a beer and talk about some of this stuff. or,
I
or,
would look forward to that a great deal.
or maybe
That's great.
I don't know. Have you ever been to Ukraine, or maybe you could come to our country?
I've not been to
Yeah,
Ukraine,
yeah,
and so that
yeah,
would
yeah,
be a wonderful experience. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and you can and if you get out west in the States, then you see that big crater.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, let's look forward to that. Okay, thank you very much for your
Very
time,
great. Take
and
care, Vanya.
take care. Okay, bye bye.